Hey there fellow creators, Ben here from Cinder Studios, and this week I want to talk about a staple that has been in my work for a very long time. Little people. How do I make these little people and how do I place them into my work? That and more coming up. So since about late 2013, I've been hiding these tiny little people in pretty much every painting I ever make. The addition of these figures really adds a grand scale to my paintings and makes things feel just that much larger. This has been such a dedicated style element for me, whether I really intended it that way or not, I definitely didn't. But people look for that in my work, so much so that it was mentioned on television.
He does a really cool thing where, for perspective, he hides a few people in it that are very small. Yeah, it's great, and then makes a really sci-fi kind of dystopian landscape.
But in my studio, there's basically no secrets. So let me show you how I do it. Okay, so for today's demo, I've got a handful of materials which I'm just going to shout out as I get to them. Starting things out with a Precise V7. This is just my go-to sketching pen. These are made by Pilot. Now, when I do the little people, what this is built around is specifically gesture drawing. Gesture drawing, if you're unfamiliar, is a way to essentially wrap around a figure in order to create the overall shape of a figure, but not necessarily anything that is unbelievably accurate. Obviously, I don't have a figure right in front of me. I'm just kind of eyeballing that. I always really loved doing gesture drawing when I was in school because it doesn't involve details or accuracy. You're just kind of capturing the overall shape, looking for the movement of the individual figure. So my little people are essentially a gesture drawing that's just scaled way, way down. I'm actually going to go ahead and zoom in a little bit more because this is actually much bigger than the little people that I normally make. So for the little people, it is essentially a gestured stick figure, more or less. So I'll do, a lot of times it's the little swoop for the legs first, and then up to the head, and just kind of build around the shoulders, and just scribble it on down. Something like that. Occasionally I'll start with the legs, occasionally I'll just kind of start with the head and the shoulders and then move down from there. Kind of all depends on really what I'm going for. Both work just fine. Just basic little simple thing. Loop for the legs. You can even extend out loop for the shoulders if you want. But really that's all you're doing is just kind of building out those shapes a little. Now, the wider stance I've found is specifically useful for a figure that's, a guy, male-centric figures. You can space things out a little bit. A lot of times I like giving my figures maybe like a sword or indication of a sword. It's classic, Zelda-style adventures or something like that. I'll stick a little staff or a sword on their back. I'll even do, extend maybe one arm out and then give them a staff. That's always really fun to do. And I'm thinking, if you're thinking about shadows and perspective, like pick a light source and then, shadows pushing the opposite, and you just kind of mimic that shape and just do that. So yeah, these figures are always, feels a lot more masculine. I found that if I want to go for something more feminine, I'll basically make essentially a teardrop shape. Where, slightly wider shoulders and then keep the legs together, something like that. And that always ends up looking, slightly more feminine, even a little tighter with the shoulders, perhaps. So when you see them, side by side, you have that little bit more of a difference between the two of them. Now, this is, simple. A pen like this, simple rollerball pen, works well for quick sketches, details, things like that. I also really enjoy using a Pigma Micron Graphic 3. These are in particular really nice because they have a chisel tip, which makes that shape just a little bit faster and easier. So in keeping it, up at an angle, so I can get nice thin lines vertically in terms of, where that chisel is angled, that is a lot faster. I can get a quick push for the legs and around. something like that. And you can think more about it, but I've found that the more loose you keep it, the more, simple things are. You can find really interesting shapes on the characters themselves. Maybe they're carrying a backpack or have like a bunch of extra things sticking out. Another one I do often is a cape. So I'll do that, and then I'll do like a little swiggle coming off the back of them, something like that. I gotta move that over here. More of a flowy cloak even. Flowy cloak and a cape going back. Something like that. So there's a lot of different little variations you can do in order to make that work. Now, when it comes to the painting side of things, this is where things shift a little bit. There's a few different methods for this. Again, depending on what brush you're using, what kind of paint, stuff like that. To start things out, though, we do want to talk about paint in general. So, again, a few different methods. My go-to is to thin out some heavy body, so like a Mars Black or something like that. You can alternatively use a thinner paint. Fluids tend to work okay for this. The high flows as well, but you got to be careful about surface tension. And if you are concerned about that surface tension, something like wetting agent that breaks the surface tension of water helps. But again, just thinning out some heavy body paint usually is the easiest thing to do. So of course, much like a lot of this other stuff in details with works, I started by using a liner brush. And liner brushes are wildly useful for all kind of detail-oriented painting. So I'm basically just getting the heavy body thinned down to where it's maybe just ever so slightly thinner than a fluid acrylic. But I like the fact that in using heavy body, it does still stick to the brush considerably. So I'm going to pull that paint up, twist the brush so I'm tapering that to a point. And then this brush just becomes essentially a pen in terms of its tip and everything like that. So you just go back to that same method. And obviously you need to do a few more strokes, but the method's more or less the same. Whether you start on top or down underneath, I do find it a little bit easier to start with the legs when you're using paint, because it allows you to build that shape out just a little easier and figure out where those stances are. Like so. Now, of course, a liner brush can be a little bit limiting, especially depending on the scale of painting you're working on. For that reason, I also really like using a small flat brush. This allows me to use actually a bit more thicker paint as well. And then using this flat brush again, think back to the pen method. It's just like using the Graphic 3, but slightly larger. And obviously you're making a bigger figure in that sense. And works, pretty much perfectly every time. Again, if you've seen any of the painting process videos I made in particular, you really can. It's a lot of times I speed it up, but you can see that just ever so slight bit of a difference. When I'm either using a liner or using the flat brush. About like that. And the best thing about the flat brush in particular method is you can scale it up really, really easily. So you can get, even a bigger brush too. I used a brush like this when I painted my my wall mural, which you guys see at the end of every video. Just load up a bit more paint on that. And our little people, it's same style and technique and whatever, but it all works the same. And just scale up that same figure. And we'll give that guy a hat. And of course, the more into doing figure work you can obviously play with the silhouette quite a lot more, and even add a bit of detail in as well. A lot of times on occasion, depending on the piece, depending on different things like that, I will add highlights I'm gonna grab just a little blob of white acrylic gouache on my palette here. And, you know, depending on where you want those highlights to be, I like to, you know, maybe throw a little bit in the back there, you know, put a little edge up around the shoulder, indication of where his arm would be. You know, edge of the pants, edge of the, you know, whatever. Not enough to really distract it from anything, but enough to just add that slight indication that the shape is not just a black silhouette, but there is a bit more depth to it. Now zoomed back out, you can see that, you know, starting with our, you know, larger gesture drawing, the largest I got to up here was just this, you know, larger paintbrush compared to where we started with the pen. And all of these add their own unique elements of scale to whatever you happen to be working on. So that's just a quick look at how I create the tiny little people that I hide in basically all of my paintings. Like I said at the top of this, I've been putting these people in my work for well over 10 years. It's become just one of those things that people look for in my work. But I'm an open book, so now I'm hoping that you guys, in learning this method, can take this little process of creating these shadowy little people to even greater heights. So whether you're a long-time painter or just a beginner, I think you'll find that this little technique for making tiny people is something that's pretty easy to do and easy to implement in your work. As always, if you enjoyed this or learned something, go ahead and hit that like button. Let me know your thoughts in comments below. Check the links in the description box where you can find more of my work, as well as just hanging out on this channel, so subscribe for more. Keep on creating, stay inspired, and I will see you guys next time. I think the guy is behind this. There he is. There he is. Hiding right there.